We're going to talk today as part of your conference, as part of your school, about green research skills. We're going to talk about developing green research and publishing skills. And this, I hope, will be useful, will be interesting, will be informative, will be helpful, especially because you're all young researchers. You're all PhD students, master's students, and bachelor's students. So just getting going, just getting started, just beginning with your research and with your professional academic journey. So let's get going. Let's talk about some research and publishing skills that I hope you can develop in this early part of your research career. But we should begin by thinking about what we mean, what the United Nations means, what the UN, climate change initiatives and all of the good things, the great things that you've been talking about in the context of this school and in the context of this program today, and of course, in the context of the recent COP meeting that was held over there in Baku, like what we mean by green skills. What do we mean by that? Well, these are skills that researchers can use, that you can develop, that you can work on, that you can hone, that you can refine, that you can add to your skill set as you develop your research portfolio as an academic, as a researcher, that will help to promote that green economy. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about in this presentation today. And I think that you are researchers from a range of different disciplines. So not just biology, not just chemistry, not just those subject areas that you can see on the slide that are particularly applicable to green skills. So when you think about the green economy, when you think about climate change and green skills, we think about subjects like renewable energy, materials science, climate change, probably the #1 thing that people would write down if you were asked to write down a research area within the green economy, within green skills, if you like. So climate change, construction, and water management. These are the kinds of research topics that I thought of, that I wrote down in my notebook when I was preparing this presentation, when I was thinking about what green research areas are. But of course, as academics, as researchers, as writing and publishing researchers, doing our PhDs, doing our master's degrees, we are, all of us, able to make a difference in terms of the green skills that we can develop as researchers. So that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation today, the research and publication process from the point of view of all young researchers, and how we can understand some key developments in publishing, in academic publishing, in academic research, in the trends within this area that will help us all to develop those skill sets as we think about the research publishing cycle. Now, as you do your master's, or as you do your PhD, or as you develop any research project over the course of your academic career, or over the course of your research career, think about your master's project or think about your PhD project, you're going to go through a range of stages in the research publishing cycle, right? First of all, you have to come up with an idea. That's the first stage. You've got to have an idea to work on before you can start to do the research, right? And often in stage 2, as academics, as researchers, we've got to come up with funding to help us develop the idea, to help us perform the research, right? So stage 1 is the idea. Stage 2 is funding. Stage 3 is actually doing the research. And that's the first part of the research publishing cycle. Then we've got to write the paper. Then we've got to get it submitted to a journal or write a book. Then we've got to wait for the peer review process to conclude. and then we're going to get the work published. We're going to promote the work, and that's the research publishing cycle. And of course, if you have any specific questions about any stages of this cycle, I can talk to you about that later. We can talk about that at the end of our presentation. But this is the kind of cycle that every researcher goes through with each of their ideas. Could be your master's project, could be your PhD project, but you go round and around and around this research publishing cycle with your ideas all of the time. So if you're a lecturer or an academic working at your university, you'll be thinking, well, hey, I've got several projects on the go that are at different stages of this research publishing cycle. Some are at stage 8. I'm waiting to promote the publication after it's appeared in the journal. I'm still doing the research for some others. Maybe you're sitting there thinking of ideas that you can work on for your next research project. But this is the cycle. And at each stage of this cycle, there are key skills that you can develop, that you can build, that you can hone, that you can refine as a researcher, that will not just help you to be more efficient, but will also help you to be greener, developing those research skills that contribute to the green economy, that contribute to green skills development. So let's keep this in mind, this research publishing cycle in mind as we go through my presentation today, because you're going to have different projects, different ideas, different components of your research at different stages of this cycle. And this is also important, right? Because when you do research, when you build a research project, when you work on a PhD project or a master's project, it's important that your research is what we call finer, or it follows what we call the finer checklist. Is the research feasible? Can you do it within the particular time frame that you have? If you've got a year or two to do a master's project, are you going to be able to come up with a project that you can do within that time frame? Is it feasible? Is the research interesting? That's another thing to think about when you come up with ideas. Is the research novel? Has somebody else done it before? And that's also a key thing to think about when putting together a research project, when building a research idea. Of course, as well, the research that you do as a student, as an early career researcher, at any stage of your research academic career, the work that you do has to be ethical as well, of course, and it's got to be relevant. So this is a great checklist to begin with, to begin that research process. When you talk to your research supervisor, for example, the academic responsible for supervising your work, think about whether you are hitting the buttons with all of this as you build a research project. Is it finer, feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant? And that's our starting point on that research cycle that I showed you on the slide before. And it's also very important as you build a research project to follow ethical principles. And this is key, not just in green skill development, but in all research project development, no matter what your research area is. Follow the guidelines of your research area, the guidelines of the journal that you plan to submit your research to. Protect your subjects. If you're doing research on human or animal subjects, you've got to get their consent. You've got to learn about how you can protect private and personal information. Of course, don't cheat. You can't hack your data, hide your data, falsify data. And as we'll talk about in this presentation in a moment, many of the AI tools that are now available to help researchers be greener, use less energy, do things much more efficiently, also have to be used ethically. If you make a submission to almost any international journal, you're going to have to declare whether or not you used an AI tool when you worked on your research project. And that could be writing, data collection, literature review, many different aspects. So we'll talk about that in a moment as well. Don't use other people's work without citing. Don't reproduce previously published work without permission. You've got to be careful not to plagiarize, and that's a big problem for researchers around the world, especially if English is not your native language. We can come back to that and talk about that as well at the end. Did you know that you can self-plagiarize if you publish a piece of research, maybe a figure or a table or a map in one publication? You've got to cite yourself if you reuse that work in subsequent publications. Authorship has to be stated in a true and effective way. No ghost authors or gift authors, as we like to call them. That's where you give authorship on a paper to somebody who hasn't done any work in the gift case, or you might pay someone, let's say, to write the paper for you. That's a ghost author. So this has also got to be looked at in terms of ethics, in terms of green research. You've got to submit your work to just one journal at a time, and as I'll come back and talk about in a moment, avoiding fake journals is also a big issue. So ethical principles, green research principles to keep in mind as you build your research, as you start the research process. But let's start thinking about green skills more specifically, and particularly about in terms of your research and in terms of your research writing and publishing, which is my area of expertise. I do training courses for researchers around the world all the time, helping with English language, helping with finding a good journal, helping with getting the work written up effectively for publication. What impact is that going to have on research and publishing? What's your footprint? And we'll talk about traditional publishing versus digital publishing in a moment. Resource consumption in your laboratory research is a topic for another day, but we are going to be writing up and publishing our research as early career researchers, as PhD students and master's students. Where we do that and how we do that has an impact on the economy, the environment, and we'll develop green publishing skills to help us manage that process. So let's begin this process as we talk about green research practices by having a bit of a think about what we like to call open access publishing and the role of open access publishing in sustainability. There's other topics here that we're not going to cover today in the context of green research practices, but one area or one thing to really have a think about as a researcher, where you're going to publish your research as a young researcher, doing that in a green, sustainable way. Have a think about whether open access journals, open access publishing would be a good place for your next paper. So what is this and why are we talking about this? Well, when you do research, when you collect data, when you write up a project for publication, it's very important to make sure that all of the information about your project, the data that you collected, the collaborations that you've had, the public trust and accountability, compliance with journal or funding agency policies is freely and openly available. And this isn't always the case in what we call traditional publishing, where journals, books, content is only accessible to universities, medical schools, if they have a subscription to that content. And we've all come across this in our daily lives as researchers, trying to access a journal article and finding out that we can't because our university doesn't have a subscription or doesn't have access. So this is traditional publishing, and it's not great in terms of sustainability, in terms of energy use, in terms of the green economy, because not everybody can access the content. Not everybody can download the content. And that's why, of course, you see the springing up of sites like Sci-Hub. I was just reading something about Sci-Hub a moment ago before coming on and doing this presentation. It's a hack, a way around this traditional subscription-based publishing model that allows people to access what would otherwise be only available to subscribing institutions. And that's not great in terms of the green economy and in terms of sustainability. I would advocate that it's a good idea to put your data, put your research results, put your publications into a format when you publish that's accessible to everybody, and that's open access. Open access publishing means that your research outputs are freely available to everyone, and this should include articles, data, results, and sometimes also the whole peer review process. Open access publishing is a newer model compared to the traditional model of publishing. That's where, of course, as we've mentioned, content is only accessible behind paywalls if your institution has a subscription. But in open access publishing, everybody can read what you've written. Everybody can see your data, results. You own the copyright. Your research is covered by copyright. Other people can reuse it with attribution, and it will be permanently archived on a recognized repository. A good example of this is PubMed Central. There are many preprint platforms as well that we'll talk about in a moment. But as a green skill, as a researcher, what about thinking about open access publishing? And this is really just part of a wider movement that we call the open science movement. Open access is a key pillar of the broader open science movement, and that basically is just arguing for putting all research information, data, figures, results, the publications themselves available for everybody to access. No limits on accessing online, which is another key important component of sustainability, of course. You can publish your research, share your data with everybody in an open and transparent way. Greater visibility, improved reproducibility, and of course, therefore, you'll get more collaborations. You'll get enhanced research collaborations as a result. So what's not to like? Over time, open access has expanded from smaller initiatives to major global policies that have now reshaped the scholarly publishing industry. And you can see a bit of a timeline here. Really, it dates back to the early 1990s when some of the first preprint platforms were launched. Archive is the oldest of the preprint platforms, and we'll talk about what preprint platforms are and what they do in a moment. But key drivers behind the rise of open access publishing have to do with cost predominantly. As we mentioned already, many traditional journals where you might have tried to access research articles in the past for your own research, not accessible because you don't have a subscription, or your institution, Baku State University, doesn't have access to that particular content. So this is great as a green initiative, as a way of saving energy, as a way of being more sustainable. We now see a demand for wider access. More researchers need up-to-date resources, as well as the rise of digital technology connected with open access publishing. About half at the moment of all research papers published around the world, different journals, different publishers, are published in open access formats. And just to summarize these for you, because I know it's quite confusing, can be quite difficult to understand the differences in the different open access models. Gold open access, that's where anyone has immediate access to your article once it's published. But, big but, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, I'm sure you've heard about this, I'm sure you've potentially interacted with this already. If you choose to publish your paper gold open access, think MDPI, Frontiers, PLOS ONE, any of these big open access publishers, somebody's got to pay an article processing charge, and that's usually the author or the funding agency. Green open access, on the other hand, that's where you put a late stage version of your research article onto an institutional or subject area repository. Sites like ResearchGate are used often for this. Diamond open access, that's where a university or a society is funding a journal. So a good example of diamond open access journals would be, by the way, the journals that Baku State University already publishes. There's no cost for authors or readers to publish their work there. The work is open access. An institution, a university, or a society will pay. That's an overview of these open access models. If you have questions, of course, there'll be time at the end of our presentation today to ask any questions. But if you choose to publish your work open access, great. I'd say that's fantastic. It might incur a cost, which we can talk about in a moment, but you're going to get more readers. You're going to get many more citations, greater impact and visibility for your work. It's compliant very often with funder mandates and will lead to more collaboration. If you publish your work in an open access journal, you get more collaborations. You're going to get more people interested in having a look at your paper, being able to download your paper. As you can see on the graph, open access papers do get more citations. So this is something that's well worth having a think about. And you can see the growth of open access publishing in this graph here. These journals are peer reviewed, of course. Like all academic journals, you should never be publishing your work, your research work, in a journal that's not using peer review properly. So that's very important as well. Open access journals are peer reviewed. They're free. The content, the article, is free for readers. The author or the funder typically covers the cost. And as we've already talked about, there's often support from universities and funders to publish your work in this green way in open access journals. So if you look at the directory of open access journals, for example, the DOAJ, the DWAJ as we like to call it, you'll find about 15,000 journals that are listed there. And there's about the same number of open access journals that are not listed. So you've got the choice of around 30,000 potential journals where you could publish your work in an open access way. And there are major policies and mandates around the world to encourage researchers to put their work into these kinds of journals. India has a whole country national license with many publishers, for example. Australia has the same model. If you're in those countries, many journals are open for you without charge to publish your work. So this may be something to think about in the context of your university or your national library as well. But as a green publishing mode, open access is really fantastic. Of course, it's a sustainable publishing strategy because, of course, nothing is being printed on paper. Nothing is being actually created. There's everything online. And this is called digital first publishing. Whereas in a traditional publishing model with traditional journals, books, and so on, you actually have to print them out and send them in the mail to subscribing universities. And how last century is that? So this is sustainable as a publishing strategy, as a kind of model for putting out your research. I would definitely encourage you to have a look at open access publishing. Many publishers have green certification, and there are many collaborations, many journals, for example, linked to the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals, collaborations with eco-conscious organizations. But the key point here is that this mode for publishing is sustainable because it's digital first. So there are traditional journals, there's paywalls that restrict access. You only get access if your institution have a subscription. You can only download content, or if you're old like me, you actually used to walk along the corridor, go to the actual library and look at the actual printed version of these journals, and that can't be sustainable, that can't be environmentally friendly, that can't be green as a publishing model. So instead, we do encourage you to have a look at open access, freely accessible content to all, but there's often a cost associated as well. And of course, many ways that young researchers can develop their skills in avoiding these charges, and we can talk about that as well at the end if you like. But one of the best ways to be green, one of the best ways to be environmentally sustainable, environmentally friendly with your research projects, is to seriously consider the use of preprint servers with your research. So let's imagine that I've done a little bit of research, I've got some results. Maybe I've presented those at a conference, I've given a conference presentation, or I've written up an abstract for a conference, or indeed I'm starting to write up a research article. At any stage of the process, at any stage of the research process, before you submit to a journal, before you go into the peer review process, it's worth thinking about putting your work onto a preprint server so that anybody can access and see what you're doing, sharing your research with everybody. Very, very, very key skill as a green research. These are online repositories for academic work, preprint servers, and they are holding copies of research before peer review and online publication. And what happens on a preprint platform, you put your work there, maybe you've given a conference talk, let's say, you can put the slides from your conference presentation onto the preprint platform. Comments and corrections from the community will come back in. You can get feedback from researchers all over the world. This improves the quality of your research. You can share it fast with other interested researchers. Peer review can also happen fast and open on these platforms if appropriate, if they're linked to journals. And very often what happens is that journal editors come in to these platforms, arXiv, bioRxiv, medRxiv, Research Square, eLife. There are many examples of preprint platforms. The largest in the world is called Research Square. The oldest is called arXiv. You may have heard of bioRxiv, medRxiv if you're working in those particular areas. People have concerns about them, but don't worry. Your priority and author intellectual property are protected on these platforms because your work gets stamped with what's called a Creative Commons license. So one final publication from your PhD thesis, let's say, published in a journal, in a peer-reviewed journal, might have a preprint track, might have several versions of that work lodged on a preprint server so other people can see how the research developed. They can help you with it as you go along. So that's a key skill to think about as well. Open access publishing we've talked about, the use of preprint platforms, but what about journal selection as well? This is very important at the start of the process. If you remember that research cycle that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, don't start to write up a paper before you have a target journal in mind. Do not, because you otherwise will be very, very inefficient. You'll be using lots of energy, you'll be using lots of versions. You won't be a green researcher. Finding a journal, targeting a journal before you begin the writing process is a key skill as well as a green researcher. So have a think. Before you begin writing your next paper, where would I like to publish it? Which journal would I like to use for that research article? Pick a journal, target a journal, have a look at that journal's guidelines, have a look at its aims and scope, the kind of structure that your paper is going to have, and then build your research article as you write it, as you bring it together around the structure of your target journal. Another key green skill. So talk to colleagues, talk to other people in your department, your PhD supervisor, your master's supervisor. Where should you be publishing your research. And again, have a look at the different kinds of open access journals that might be available to you for your research article. Where can you publish? Check that journal's reputation. Very, very important to ask other colleagues, other researchers. Do you recognize any of the recent authors who've published in that journal? Are they known in your field? Verify if the journal that you're selecting for your research article is indexed in the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, or indeed other reputable directories that I'll show you in a moment. And looking for journals at the start of your research journey. So if you're beginning your master's project, you're beginning your PhD research, let's already start thinking about where we could be publishing that work. Which journals could we be using as vehicles for that final publication? Very important to begin early with a journal choice. That's a green strategy. It's a key skill for young researchers. And do have a look at these resources. The Spark Author Addendum. That's a great place to begin. Sherpa Romeo will give you, that website will give you publisher policies on self-archiving content. You can find these websites in an instant just by doing a quick Google search. The one I've talked about already, the Directory of Open Access Journals, very important place to begin. And this one called Open Door, the Directory of Open Access Repositories. And I also point you to a fantastic website called thinkchecksubmit.com. Think, Check, Submit. It will help you with a range of guidelines and a range of tips and tricks for you to choose a trustworthy journal for your next research article. Because of course, as you know, as you will be well aware, open access publishing, because there's a cost involved for researchers, has led to the development of a number of what we like to call predatory journals, which we'll talk about in a moment, but journals and publishers that are only interested in taking your money and not really publishing the work in a proper peer-reviewed way. So selecting the right open access journal as a green researcher, very important. Is the journal that you are selecting listed in a reputable directory like the Directory of Open Access Journals? What are the licensing and copyright policies of that journal, and are there any publication fees? And again, you can always talk to me if you need some help picking a journal for your next research project. You can always get in touch with me. You can find me easily online. I'll give you my contact details at the end of this presentation. But picking a journal, finding a journal at the beginning of the research process is very, very important. But of course, we've got to watch out for fake open access journals. So go through this quick checklist. If you're like me, you'll be getting emails all of the time from journals, from publishers, inviting you to submit a paper or guest edit a special issue for one of their journals. And this is a bit intimidating. It's a bit scary as a researcher, because the emails that come in all the time, you don't know if they're coming from real journals, or are they coming from journals that are a bit fake? So is the journal listed in a reputable directory? Can you verify who's on the journal's editorial board? And don't be shy about writing to people and asking them, are you on this journal's editorial board? Because lots of fake journals will put people onto their editorial boards without telling them, just to make it look more impressive. Does the journal have a robust ethical peer review practice? And watch out for these red flags. Never pay a fee for publishing a paper before the paper has been accepted. Unclear fees or fees charged before peer review are a big red flag. A reputable open access journal will be taking your submission, deciding whether they want to send it out for peer review or not, sending it out for peer review, and then you get the comments back, you get to make changes, you get to then hopefully get the paper accepted, and then you may have to pay an article processing charge. Never pay before final acceptance of the article. Also, watch out for spam emails. We talked about that already. Soliciting articles. You can always talk to me if you have any questions about this. Misleading metrics, fake impact factors, or the editorial board not being listed on the journal website, or it appears like it was put together in a big rush. Have a look at these factors. These are tips for you to identify fake journals. And I would also strongly encourage you that when you are ready with an article, you've got your results, you're ready to start thinking about making a submission to a journal, another great green skill for you is to make what we call a pre-submission inquiry. Write to journal editors at different journals and ask them if they would be interested in publishing your work. And you can do this to as many journal editors as you like. It's part of the process of targeting a journal for your submission. Editors really appreciate receiving these kinds of inquiries. You can reach out with your abstract and with your title, communicate with the journal editor. This helps save time, energy. It's a key green research skill. I'll give you an email template that you can use to do this after the presentation today. But writing and communicating with editors is really important as well. Pick 5 or 6 journals that you might wish to use for your next research paper. Send the journal editors emails. I've got these results, I've got this outcome, this conclusion. Would you be interested in peer reviewing an article on this topic? They might say no. They might say, please go to another journal in our family. Or they might say, great, let's see the paper. If you get ahead of the game, you're already there with your pre-submission inquiry. You're already able to start thinking about where the research might get published. And quickly, as a green skill, technology is becoming increasingly important. I can give whole presentations for you on AI tools and how to use them as researchers, but we are now, as researchers, developing our skills in the use of AI as an optimization for efficiency in research. And of course, this is a great way to become a green researcher. This means that in less than 10 years, the amount of compute used to train the best AI models has increased by 9 orders of magnitude. So these tools are getting faster and faster and faster. It's incredible what we can do now with AI. I'm sure you're all using it every day in your research. If you're not, you totally should be, because it's a great green skill. You can use these AI tools to speed up your literature searches as a researcher, for example. What were we doing before? Well, we were using Google Scholar. We were using databases. We were developing a search strategy on our own, exhausting, going through all of the literature. And now we can do it with ChatGPT. We can use it with Elicit, Consensus, Scholarly, Cite, a number of key tools for you that will do the literature work for you, that will speed up the literature search component of your research. So if you're not sure how to use any of these tools, I could come back and give another presentation helping you to develop ways to use AI to speed up your literature searches. Here's a range of examples for you on the screen. Speeding up a literature search, specialized scientific AI-based search engines that take away the pain from being on top of all of the literature in your research field. In the old days, we were gatherers. We were gatherers as researchers. And this is the kind of approach that I would have taken as a PhD student all of those years ago, photocopying and collecting loads of literature and then evaluating the literature and looking for research gaps. Now, thanks to the rise in AI tools, we're able to quickly evaluate huge amounts of literature using many of the tools that I've shown you, and of course, I'll give you this PDF. You can have a look at these tools later. Do not spend hours and hours searching the literature. There are AI tools that will do it for you. Make notes on key messages, group papers together, cite fairly and in a balanced way, and don't be negative or aggressive with your citation approaches. But above all, develop green skills to use AI effectively in your literature searches, but also in your reading and note-taking. How are you doing this? Are you using the old approach where you've got a huge pile of paper that you're reading through? No, you should be using tools like SciSpace, like Copilot, that read for you and extract key information from papers to help you speed up your research process. Finding literature, evaluating literature, you don't have to do it in the old-fashioned way. You can do it in the new way using AI tools to build your sustainability, to build in cost savings, and to also improve your reputation and trust. Because of course, the faster that you go through the research cycle that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, the enhanced improvements there will be to both your reputation and trust. There are challenges, of course, costs, our awareness. You need training if you're going to be able to use a range of AI tools to speed up your research. Of course, we could provide that training. We could come back and help you learn about the different tools that you could be using in your research, training, and accessing and accessibility of these different tools. And funding agencies have a role to play in this as well. As we build out open research and open science, money coming from our funding agencies, which I presume is your national government most often in your country, that will help you as a way of building and developing your green and sustainable skills. So let's end this presentation with a call to action. Support open access. Share your research as broadly as possible. Let's commit, all of us, to sustainable practices in research and publishing, like open access, like the use of preprint platforms, like making pre-submission inquiries, selecting journals early, and exploring the huge range of AI tools and resources that you could be using to build a more effective research project. Build more efficiency into your daily life as a researcher as we collaborate and innovate in the future. I'm Gareth. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. This is the range of training that we do provide. We have a small company called SciTrain. You can have a look at scitrain.com on the internet. These are the areas where we focus our training for researchers around the world, especially, as I mentioned, for researchers for whom English is not a native language. So you can see we're training researchers to be more personally effective, understanding and developing your knowledge and intellectual abilities, understanding about research governance and organization and engagement, influence and impact with your research, planning your publication, grant writing, ethics, data collection, effective writing, journal submission, peer review, presenting skills, and promoting for impact.